The first section of this unit is on the history of life on Earth. So, first of all, a scientific theory is an explanation of an aspect of the natural world that can be tested and verified through the scientific method. It takes into account all known observations, experiments, and data. And if new data doesn't fit the theory must be revised or rejected. And this is really important in terms of evolution because evolution is a theory that's based on evidence. And as we get into the unit, we'll talk about how theories have been proposed and then had to be rejected upon new information. So when we have a theory, we have to take into account everything we know. We can't omit things just because we feel it doesn't fit with the theory. That's not how a scientific theory works. So, the theory of evolution is change over time in a population. And it's based on the idea that all species are related on some level. Populations have genetic variation reflected in the physical characteristics they show, and a change in the genetics can change the physical characteristics of a population. And the current theory of evolution is the theory of natural selection. So, the Big Bang Theory is another scientific theory, and it's the explanation of how the universe began. And the Big Bang Theory states that the universe began with something called a small singularity, which is a compact ball of matter and energy. There was then an explosion and expansion of matter and energy, and it inflated over 13.8 billion years to the cosmos of today. And based on scientific studies and evidence, we are still in this expansion stage of the Big Bang Theory. So we could say that we're still undergoing that continual expansion as an effect of the Big Bang Theory even today. So the Big Bang Theory explains the origin of all known matter, the laws of physics, the large scale structure of the universe, and the expansion of the universe. The evidence that we have to support the Big Bang Theory is that astronomers see an echo of expansion through something called cosmic microwave background. Cosmic microwave background, or CMB, is leftover radiation from the Big Bang, and it represents the heat that's left from the Big Bang. So we have astronomical evidence, and there's also evidence based on mathematical formulas and models. So the Earth and everything else in the universe would have formed as a result of the Big Bang. And in terms of the formation of the Earth has formed through what scientists call the solar nebula theory. So our entire solar system formed from a rotating cloud of gas and dust called a solar nebula. This solar nebula collapsed because of gravity, and as it collapsed, it spun faster, flattened into a disk. Most material was pulled towards the center to form the sun, and other matter condensed to smaller, denser clumps in other locations. And the clumps rotated, collapsed, and then formed the stars and the planets of the universe. So Earth would have formed as one of those smaller, denser clumps. So Earth formed, it was a process, and about 4.6 billion years ago, Earth was fully formed. Early Earth was much different than the Earth that we are familiar with today. Early Earth was too hot for water to be in a liquid form, so any water was in the form of water vapor. And there were also many gases present in Earth's atmosphere. things like hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen cyanide, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen. Most of those gases are poisonous to us. So Earth would have been a much hotter, more hostile place based on what was in the atmosphere. One important thing to note is that the atmosphere lacked oxygen, something that life is dependent upon today. And early Earth is called a violent place because it would have been very unstable. Lots of storms, volcanoes, radiation, so a very inhospitable place. Over time, Earth cooled, and about 4 billion years ago, Earth cooled enough for rock to solidify. And then Earth continued to cool, and at about 3.8 billion years ago, Earth was cool enough to have water as a liquid on Earth's surface. Once there was liquid water, the conditions became optimal for the formation of life soon after. So the formation of liquid water was really important. So scientists agree that there's 8 steps to the evolution of multicellular life. So for us to go from early Earth to life as we know it today, there was 8 different steps that would have had to occur. Step 1, the formation of chemicals needed for life. So this refers to the primordial soup theory. This says that conditions on early Earth produce spontaneous chemical reactions in water. Energy for these reactions would have come from the excessive heat and the light. These would have changed simple inorganic molecules to more complex organic molecules. And eventually, these complex organic molecules were the building blocks of life. And specifically, this would have been amino acids and other compounds that we know living things rely upon. The conditions on early Earth were optimal for this to occur. The reactants were the atmospheric gases and the inorganic chemicals in the water. The energy would have come from lightning, radiation from the sun, and geothermal heat, mainly from volcanoes. And the conditions on today's atmosphere on Earth are not optimal. We don't have the same gaseous reactants, and we don't have the same violent energy sources that early Earth had. Experimental evidence to support this primordial soup theory comes from scientists Miller and Urey. In their experiment, they attempted to simulate conditions on the early Earth. So they had heat, they created an artificial atmosphere of methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor. They simulated an electrical lightning storm by providing electric sparks. And then they created artificial rain through the condensation that occurred in their apparatus. So their results showed that complex amino acids accumulated in the water that was produced in the experiment. This was extremely important because amino acids are needed for living things. Specifically, they're needed to produce proteins. So this experiment demonstrated how complex compounds necessary for living things could have formed. Over time, this experiment has been reproduced with similar results under a variety of circumstances. So even if some of those original circumstances were changed to reflect new information, scientists have still been able to form even other organic compounds of carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids, in addition to the amino acids that were originally formed. Be sure to have watched this video that goes over Miller and Urey's experiment for more clarification on how that worked. So step 2 is the formation of precells or protocells. And this was due to the formation of things called proteinoid microspheres. These are structures formed by amino acids forming spherical chains. Proteinoid microspheres are not cells. They don't have any organic molecules inside of them, but they do have some similar characteristics to cells. They have a double-layered membrane, they are selectively permeable, and they have the ability to show fusion and budding. The experimental evidence that supports this idea of proteinoid microspheres is that these can actually be formed in a simple lab by combining amino acids in a solution with the appropriate temperature and pH. So we would be able to form these if we have the right conditions, just like they would have been able to form spontaneously on early Earth under those same sorts of conditions. Miller and Urey's experiment and others showed how sugars, phosphates, and nitrogen bases needed for nucleotides could have formed in the primordial soup. So step 3 is the formation of nucleic acids and proteins. And so the experimental evidence to help support this is that RNA can form spontaneously in water with the right organic materials present. So this leads to the RNA world hypothesis, where a primitive RNA-like nucleic acid could have formed proteins by assembling amino acids in the primordial soup. And it's likely that DNA evolved from RNA because DNA is a more complex molecule and it's a more stable molecule. Here's another video to make sure that you take the time to watch that goes over the formation of the RNA world hypothesis. So then that leads to step 4, the evolution of prokaryotes. So the idea of a nucleic acid becoming trapped in a microsphere, that would be how scientists believe the first prokaryotic cell developed. This would have the ability to divide in half to make more of itself. And so that was the first form of asexual reproduction. The evidence for the evolution of prokaryotes come from prokaryotic microfossils, which the first ones found were in Australian stromatolites. Stromatolites are rock structures that are dated to be approximately 3 billion years old. And in addition to Australia, these stromatolites have also been found in other locations, and they have microscopic fossils of prokaryotes. These prokaryotes are believed to have been photosynthetic, meaning they would produce oxygen. And this was a really important step because remember, the early Earth's atmosphere did not have oxygen, but these microfossils showed that the prokaryotes would have been doing photosynthesis and started to put oxygen into the atmosphere. Step 5, free oxygen increases and the ozone layer forms. So early prokaryotes were believed to be photosynthetic, and so through photosynthesis, they would have produced oxygen as a waste, causing oxygen to accumulate in the atmosphere. This is believed to have taken place approximately 2.33 billion years ago. It allowed for the development of more efficient metabolism using this oxygen. And some of that oxygen would have been converted into ozone. Ozone was a very important development because ozone absorbs ultraviolet radiation that can cause lethal mutations. So this allowed the evolution of other organisms that could now live on land. Organisms no longer needed to be in the water to be protected from ultraviolet radiation and mutations. Now the ozone was providing that protection. Step 6, the evolution of eukaryotes. And this is explained through the endosymbiotic theory. So this is believed to have taken place approximately 2 billion years ago. And a small prokaryote is believed to have entered a larger prokaryote. Maybe it entered as a parasite, or maybe it was prey for the larger prokaryote. Either way, that small prokaryote actually started helping the larger prokaryote. So they developed this mutualistic relationship. Some of these smaller prokaryotes inside the larger prokaryote would be able to trap sunlight for food. And so those would have been the early chloroplasts. Some would have had the ability to release energy, and those would have been early mitochondria. The evidence that supports this idea is that mitochondria and chloroplasts resemble prokaryotes, and they contain their own DNA, just like prokaryotic cells. Step 7, sexual reproduction. This is when cells began exchanging their DNA about 2 billion years ago. This was important because it allowed the creation of unique offspring. Before this, when we just had asexual reproduction, all offspring were identical to each other and identical to the parent cell. Sexual reproduction allowed the combination of DNA from two different sources to create unique offspring. And this allowed changes between organisms to occur more quickly because offspring were no longer identical. They had their own unique characteristics. This offers better survivability because if we had an identical population, one factor that could wipe out one individual could wipe out the entire population. With sexual reproduction and the ability to be unique, those genetic differences allow some to survive better over others. And they have the possibility that offspring have a better chance for survival than the previous generation. So then that leads to step 8, multicellularity. Single-celled organisms began to group together, and these grouped cells, called colonies, began to specialize. This is called division of labor. Rather than each individual cell having to do everything for themselves, cells could start to specialize in certain jobs and help each other out. And through this, cells started to need each other for survival. Cell specialization allowed for the development of more complex organisms, and it's believed that this took place about 600 million years ago.